Hey guys. So one of the most common questions I've received over the course of the past 2 or so weeks is which NAS device you should buy if you're not interested in buying one of Synology's new models because of some of their changes, we'll say. And to be honest, it's not the easiest question to answer because Synology DSM is a very strong offering, which to be honest is why people are upset. They want to use it, but some of the business practices make it harder to support. So if you're not going to buy Synology, what are you going to buy? The problem is that is a loaded question because hardware is a factor, but the more important question is which NAS operating system is the most comparable. And if it's not comparable, what does it offer to you that will make you want to use it? So we will look at two categories in this video: DIY NAS devices and pre-built NAS devices. And then I'll give you my personal pick on what I'd buy after testing a bunch of these devices out. So first we'll look at DIY NAS devices. The benefit to DIY NAS devices is that you can use whatever hardware that you want. You could use a pre-built device like a LinkStation S1, which I did a video on recently. Basically, it's a pre-built NAS device and it comes with Unraid pre-installed. You could buy a UGREEN device or a TerraMaster device, and you can install a third-party NAS operating system on that. You could use a NAS device that hasn't even come out yet, something like the Minisforum NAS, which we're not positive what it's going to come with, but it would be a great candidate for you to install your own NAS operating system on. And the last case would be that you could build something yourself, which is what I recently did, and I installed TrueNAS Community Edition on it, which is formerly TrueNAS Scale. But overall, it's been running very well. Now, the hardware, for the most part, is going to be significantly better than anything that you could buy off the shelf that Synology would offer. But the biggest decider for most people should be the operating system because that's where you're going to be interacting the most. So to summarize it, you're going to get better hardware, but the software is where you need to focus. So for the operating system, there are three main DIY NAS operating systems that you could use. The first is OpenMediaVault. The second is TrueNAS Community Edition, which again is TrueNAS Scale, which I just did a video on, a setup video if you're interested in just understanding how that works. And the third is Unraid. Now, I did a video comparing them as well, which I'll leave a link to in the description, but that comparison's about 6 months out of date now. Overall, 90 to 95% of it is still the same, but there are a few minor differences here and there. So if you want to check that out, I'll link that below. Now, one of the downsides of these NAS operating systems is that if you're used to Synology DSM, it's going to work very different than what you're used to. So for example, you have a Synology NAS, and you open up Synology DSM and you want to just browse your files. In Synology DSM, you would open up FileStation and you would just go through and you'd be able to upload files, download files, see exactly what's on the NAS. With some of these third-party NAS operating systems, that's not really the case. So using TrueNAS as an example, you create data sets, but the way that you access the data in those data sets is generally through SMB. So there's not like a file browser built into TrueNAS. Now, you can install a tool through Docker, which is what they're using currently, but through their app section, you can install a tool that would allow you to do that. But it's not native functionality. So as soon as you start to use it, you're going to notice very, very big differences. Next would be permissions, and permissions are very different as well. So because TrueNAS uses ZFS, they use something called ACLs. ACLs are access control lists. Access control lists to beginners are very, very confusing. However, as soon as you get to kind of understand how they work, it's really not that bad. But the point is, if you're used to managing permissions in Synology DSM, it's going to be drastically different using any of these other NAS operating systems. Now, Unraid and OpenMediaVault are similar but different in their own regard. So you kind of have to go through each of them, understand how you would access the data, how you would manage permissions, etc. But the point is, if you're used to Synology DSM, this is not something that skill set translates to. You don't understand how Synology DSM works and immediately understand how TrueNAS or Unraid works. But if you understand some of the basics, then of course you can use any of those NAS operating systems and you'd have a general understanding of how it works. Finally, they don't really have first-party apps. So with Synology DSM, you're going to be used to things like Synology Drive, Synology Photos, Synology Hyper Backup, Cloud Sync, etc. These tools might have backup tools built into them or cloud sync tools like TrueNAS built into them. But in terms of first-party applications, you're not going to get a Synology drive. You're going to be using third-party applications, generally through Docker, which to some people is great. That's what you might be using right now. To other people, though, if you're currently using any of those first-party applications, utilizing something like Docker to actually set everything up might not really be something that you want to do. So just keep that in mind. You're not getting first-party applications. You're generally going to be relying on third-party applications, which could be a benefit, but at the end of the day, it's not going to function or be used the same way, especially from a configuration standpoint. So now that we got DIY NAS devices and DIY NAS operating systems out of the way, let's look at pre-built NAS operating systems. And for the most part, this is going to be a one-for-one replacement, meaning that you're going to buy a NAS device, and then at the same time, you're generally going to get a first-party NAS operating system. So for example, TerraMaster, UGREEN, QNAP, Asus Store, etc. They're pre-built NAS devices, and they come with their own proprietary first-party NAS operating system. Now, this is generally going to function the same way that it does with Synology DSM, meaning that you're going to go through, add your hard drives to the NAS, you're going to put it in the corner, and then you're going to access it through a web browser. And to be clear, for OpenMediaVault, Unraid, and TrueNAS as well, it's the same thing. But my point is that you're going to access the NAS the same way that you currently do. However, the way you interact with some of these settings is where the big differences occur. Now, this is where some of this can get a little challenging. And I'm going to use TerraMaster as an example here, but to be honest, this translates a little to all of them. So some of these NAS companies are not trying to be like Synology. They are trying to be Synology. So what I mean by that is Synology updated their Docker application and went from Docker to Container Manager. If you open the Docker application on UGREEN OS or on TerraMaster's OS, you will see that for the most part, it matches Synology's Container Manager, which is new. And if you've used these for a while, you would know that that's not how they initially were. So what they're really doing is they're aligning themselves very, very closely with Synology DSM. You could view that as a positive because you could view that and say, well, I'm used to how Synology DSM works, so now I'm going to replace it with this other NAS device. And when I open Docker, it's going to be the same way that it was on Synology DSM. That is the bright side of this. The downside, however, is when you are that comparable, meaning that it even looks and functions like the other application, it is impossible not to compare them. So for example, if you run into any problems, you might say, hey, that doesn't happen in Synology DSM, but it happens here. It might be frustrating. So in general, I don't love the fact that they align so closely with Synology DSM because it makes it impossible not to compare them. And then at that level, when you are comparing them that closely, you're looking at Synology DSM Lite or a version of Synology DSM that has not matured yet. And that's where it gets tough because if you're going to use a NAS operating system that is close to Synology but not quite Synology DSM, why wouldn't you just buy a Synology NAS? And that's always been my problem with these NAS companies is generally they're not trying to become something new. They're not trying to be their own identity. They're trying to be Synology. And Synology has 25 years in this game. They're not going to be able to compare. So that's just a nitpick that I've never personally liked. But the point is that some of these are going to be extremely comparable to Synology DSM. Now for UGREEN in specific, it's a little different because they actually scaled back the scope. So they're very comparable. Again, you open their Docker application, it's going to be the same. But they've scaled back. They're not trying to produce a one-for-one application the way, let's say, TerraMaster is. So TerraMaster, for the most part, they have a one-to-one solution in some way to just about every first-party Synology application. And some of what they do is great. Like they have this awesome diagram that shows you exactly how all their backup tools work, which I love because even if you're a new Synology user, you might not know the difference between Synology Cloud Sync and Hyper Backup and Synology Drive and when you should use which, especially when you add an active backup for business. So I love what TerraMaster did there. The problem comes in that, unfortunately, their tools tend to lack compared to Synology DSM. But for UGREEN in specific, UGREEN is similar, but they didn't try to one-for-one replace every Synology application, which I like. Now, overall, the most important part then becomes, what are your requirements? So if you are just planning on using a NAS device and you just want to store some data on it, then you might be looking for things like file services. So SMB, NFS, possibly iSCSI. You'll have to compare each one of them. So for example, UGREEN as of right now does not support iSCSI. So if you had and used that on Synology DSM, that might not be an option for you. But again, you could then possibly look at third-party operating systems. But anyway, so you really have to compare what you're currently using. So some of what I just said might not be valid for you. You might go through that and say, hey, I don't use any of that. And in that case, well, great, then this is not important for you. But look at what you're currently using in Synology DSM, and now you have to compare it. And I'm going to write an article that I'll link in the description, and I'm just going to highlight some of those differences. But look at what you're doing and then move on to the next step. Now, another pre-built NAS operating system that I really like that is nothing like Synology DSM or UGREEN or TerraMaster or QNAP is Ubiquiti's UNAS Pro. In general, it's pretty cheap for what you get, meaning 7 bays, you get 10 gigabit networking, you get a fairly underpowered device in comparison to some of these other NAS devices. But Ubiquiti had a very clear plan here. They wanted to build storage, they wanted it to be reasonably priced, and they wanted it to work easily. So it's not totally fair to compare hardware in this case, because one of the biggest deciding factors with Synology DSM is overall the hardware is very underpowered in comparison to what you can use it for. And that's because Synology DSM is so powerful. With Ubiquiti's UNAS Pro, that's not really the case because the hardware generally aligns fairly well with the software that they're currently providing. Now, could the processor be a little more powerful so that you could fully saturate the 10 gigabit connection? Yes, that would be nice. But overall, it's hard to be frustrated with them, especially at the price point. Now, if you use your Synology NAS for a lot, we'll say Synology Drive, you use it for backups, you use it for your photos, your media, stuff like that. If you wanted the UNAS Pro, you're going to have to add a mini PC to it. And I did a video that shows you how to add Docker and I think it was Jellyfin to a UNAS Pro, and it works very well. Overall, though, my point in saying this is that you're not buying a device that would be able to replace a Synology NAS if you just bought the NAS device. But a NAS device with a cheap, like $100 mini PC would still have the price point pretty low, and overall you would get a lot of power out of it. Now again, that device is pretty polarizing to people because it lacks a lot of features that the other NAS devices currently have. Like RAID 6 support was just added. It lacks iSCSI. Some of the backup features it doesn't currently have that you would want. But if you're looking for just storage, if you just want network attached storage, it is going to be hard to beat that. And I'll explain why, but I really like the UNAS Pro. Now, there are plenty of other NAS operating systems on the market as well, as this market has grown tremendously over the years. And like I've said, QNAP, Asus Store, etc. But you really have to find a NAS operating system that does what you're looking to do. That is the most important thing. So with all of that said, here are some of my recommendations. If you want to use a DIY NAS, I don't think that you can go wrong, but it's going to be more work. You're going to have to pick the hardware. You're going to have to get the operating system installed on it, and then you're going to have to learn how it works. So unlike a pre-built NAS device that comes with a first-party NAS operating system where you basically buy it, put your hard drives in, turn it on, and configure it, this is going to be a very, very different process than that. If you did go that route, I'd personally side with TrueNAS. I've been using it. I really like it. I do really like Unraid as well. I just don't love the licensing costs. So Unraid has licensing costs, and they've recently changed that model. So it's going to be more of a subscription-like model. And I say subscription-like model because It's based on the versions. So depending on when you install it and when Unraid releases versions, you might have to update more frequently. So you'll have to keep that in mind. But overall, those are two rock solid NAS operating systems, and I think you'd be very happy with either of them. Now, if you want a pre-built NAS device, I'd look at UGREEN and I'd look at the UNAS Pro. The UNAS Pro is one device. It has 7 bays. You get what you get with it. With UGREEN, they have various different models. So they have, I think, a 2-bay, a 4-bay, an 8-bay. There are more devices coming in a few months from now. So if you're somebody that only wants 2 bays, you might want to go in that direction. But overall, looking at your requirements, that's going to determine which process and which step you want to use. So if you want the UNAS Pro, you would not install a third-party OS on it. If you wanted to use a UGREEN, you could use UGREEN's OS, or you could install a third-party NAS operating system on it. But overall, the UGREEN devices are extremely, extremely powerful, and they're very premium. It's probably the nicest overall NAS device that I've used and interacted with. And that's not to say the UNAS Pro isn't, because the UNAS Pro is up there as well, but the UNAS Pro is in a rack mount form. If you want a desktop grade form factor, the UGREEN devices are very hard to beat in that area. And to be clear, UGREEN's operating system has gotten drastically better than when I initially reviewed it. It is much better. I had a lot of problems back then, but I've been using it, just testing it out. And overall, I can't say that it's great for day-to-day usage because I don't use it that way. But just in some of my testing, some of the problems I ran into, overall, I've been pretty happy with it. So with all of that said, which one is my favorite? And some people are not going to like this response. The UNAS Pro is my favorite device, and I'm going to tell you why. Like I said earlier, every single NAS manufacturer has tried to be Synology. They want to compete with Synology. They want to be viewed as a Synology competitor. They want to offer the same tools and features and functionality that Synology DSM offers. And Ubiquiti is the first company that has come out and said, we don't care what anybody else on the market has tried to do. We're going to try and build a first-party NAS operating system that's easy to use, easy to interact with, and works well. Now, of course, you can go through and say, well, the UNAS Pro doesn't have a lot of the features and functionality that I need. So for example, you might need encrypted backups, encrypted offsite backups, we'll say. You might need iSCSI support. The point is that overall, the UNAS Pro is not trying to be Synology. They are trying to bring their own identity to what a NAS could be. And the problem with the other NAS manufacturers outside of Synology is that because they're trying to be like Synology and be an alternative to Synology, they generally fall short when you compare them head to head. So if you use the UNAS Pro, you don't come away saying, wow, this device is not very good in comparison to Synology DSM, because it's nothing like it. As you start to navigate and use it, you're not comparing it one for one with Synology DSM. When you use most of the other first-party NAS operating systems, your takeaway is that this is not as good as Synology DSM. And I think that that's important to highlight, because overall, if you want something that looks and functions like Synology DSM, you probably just want Synology DSM. And now we're going to have to talk about the hard drives, which we'll talk about in a second here. But the point is that for every other NAS manufacturer, until Synology implemented this hard drive ban, which at this point, we're still not totally clear on how that's going to play out. Until Synology implemented that hard drive ban, you were better off probably buying a Synology NAS if you wanted something comparable to Synology DSM because it was superior to them. Now we get to the point where we're taking other factors into consideration. Do you have hard drives that you want to use? Can you migrate your current storage pool to a new Synology, let's say DS925 Plus, if that's what you wanted to do? When you use a Ubiquiti UNAS Pro, you're not taking any of that into consideration. You're looking at it as a first-party NAS operating system that is what they offer. It's not something that you compare. Now, of course, if you compare and go down a list and say, these are all the features that Synology DSM offers, or even UGREEN, or TerraMaster, or QNAP, The UNAS Pro is going to fall short in just about every single regard because overall, they offer a very, very small product offering right now. Now, this will change in the future, but right now it's a very small product offering in comparison to some of those competitors. But overall, it was designed without competitors in mind. And you might like that or you might hate it, but you're getting a fresh take on what a manufacturer views a NAS device to be. And here's the truth. Thanks to you guys, and again, thank you, I have been sent various NAS devices that I've tested over the years from various manufacturers. Every single one of them I do not use for my personal usage. The only one that I personally use on a day-to-day basis is the UNAS Pro. So in my personal life, the UNAS Pro is the only NAS device that I use on a daily basis. There are three. I use the TrueNAS build I just built, I use the Ubiquiti UNAS Pro, and I use my Synology DS1019 Plus that I bought back in 2019. So not even Synology has not even sent me a NAS device that I use for personal usage. I use the NAS device that I purchased. The UNAS Pro is just, as soon as you start to use it, you realize that it's very easy to use. And it's just, if you need storage, it's so easy to interact with and set up that you naturally gravitate towards it. And that's what happened to me. I wasn't really planning on using it, but as time has gone on, I just find myself naturally gravitating to it because of how easy it is to use. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be good for you, but it does mean that for somebody that has tested a lot of these devices out, for them to use none of it, not a single one of them. They all collect dust back there until I turn it on for an upgrade or something to see what's changed and see, if it's better than it was, etc. Until that situation arises, I don't turn those on. The UNAS Pro is something I use every day. So take that for what it's worth. I'm not saying that's a reason to go out and buy it, but it is in some way a valuable piece of information. Now, I know that that's going to be a polarizing take to a lot of people. But I can't stress enough that the companies that are trying to be like Synology at this point in time, from an operating system perspective, are still behind Synology. So you're going to get the device, start to use it, and you're going to compare it to Synology DSM. So if you're comfortable growing with a NAS operating system as it gets better, I think they're all great options. However, if you want something that is just going to work as soon as you get it, you might still want to go the Synology route. We got to see how this hard drive stuff plays out. If you can upgrade to it, or if they relax some of these hard drive rules, Synology is still going to be a great option for a lot of people. It still might be the best option for a lot of people, but we kind of have to wait and see how this all plays out. So with all of this said, the biggest takeaway is probably that there's not a right or wrong device for everybody. The UGREEN might be best for some. The UNAS Pro might be best for others. For power users, you might want to build your own NAS and use TrueNAS or Unraid. You really have to look at your requirements, as I've said multiple times in this video, and determine what is the most important feature set for you. And then at that point, you can scale back and say, okay, these are my requirements. This is what makes the most sense. So again, in that article I'm going to post, it'll have some different features that you could use for each of these operating systems to just generally explain some of what you can do on them. But overall, you're probably going to have to do a deeper dive on them to determine exactly what is best for you. So if you made it this far and you want to support the channel, I will have some affiliate links in the description that you can use to purchase these devices. You don't have to. That's only if you want to support the channel and you got some value out of this video. But if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I will see you guys next time.